The courtroom buzzed with whispers when the double doors of the Lincoln County Courthouse in Riverside, California creaked open. Judge William Harwood chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling over the rims of his reading glasses, as he caught sight of the teenager striding in. Jonathan Mitchell, just 18 years old, wore his father's old Navy suit, the fabric hanging loose on his slight frame, the jacket sleeves draped over his knuckles, hiding most of his hands, and the tie knotted clumsily, tilted to one side like a flag caught in a breeze. The briefcase he carried, scuffed and worn, looked like it had been through decades of use, its leather edges frayed from being passed down through the family. Yet Jonathan moved with a quiet confidence, his back straight, his dark eyes fixed forward as if he'd walked this path 100 times before. The crowd turned, their murmurs rippling like a wave. Who was this boy? A clerk's younger brother? A kid who'd wandered in from the Riverside streets? A woman in the second row leaned toward her friend, whispering, "He looks like he's playing dress-up." A few others stifled laughs, their eyes lingering on the ill-fitting suit. Jonathan didn't flinch. His heart thumped hard in his chest, but his face stayed calm, betraying none of the nerves that clawed at him. He could feel every stare, every smirk, but he kept his gaze on the defense table ahead, his steps deliberate on the polished wooden floor. That morning, as he'd stood in front of the cracked mirror in his family's small apartment, his mother had adjusted the tie for him. Her hands, rough from years of cleaning houses, trembled slightly as she smoothed the fabric. "Keep your head up, Joan," she'd said, her voice thick with pride and worry. "You're doing this for Samuel. Let them see who you are." Jonathan had nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He could still smell the faint cedar scent of the suit, a relic of his father's better days, and it grounded him now as he crossed the courtroom. This wasn't just about him, it was about his brother, Samuel, who was waiting in his cell, counting on him. Judge Harwood leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening as he pushed his glasses up his nose. It wasn't a kind smile, it was the kind that carried weight, the kind that said he'd seen it all and wasn't impressed. His gaze flicked over Jonathan, taking in the oversized jacket, the crooked tie, the briefcase that looked like it might fall apart. He didn't speak at first, just let the silence stretch, letting the room feel the absurdity of this teenager standing where seasoned lawyers should be. A man in the back row coughed, the sound sharp in the quiet, and a young clerk by the wall exchanged a glance with her colleague, her eyebrows raised. Jonathan reached the defense table and set the briefcase down with a soft thud. His fingers, hidden under the two long sleeves, fumbled briefly with the latch, but he steadied himself. He wasn't here to impress them with his appearance. He was here for Samuel, for the truth. As he opened the briefcase, pulling out 3 neatly stacked file folders and a dog-eared copy of the California Penal Code, the whispers in the room grew softer, then stopped. A few people leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. The boy in the baggy suit wasn't just a spectacle anymore. He was something else, something they couldn't quite name yet. Jonathan arranged the folders carefully, his movements precise, like a craftsman setting out tools before a job. He could feel the weight of his mother's words, the memory of her hands on his shoulders pushing him forward. He thought of Samuel, too, the way his brother used to ruffle his hair and call him kid, with a grin. That grin was gone now, replaced by the tired lines Jonathan had seen on Samuel's face during their last visit at the county jail. This suit, this courtroom, this moment, it was all for him. Jonathan lifted his chin, his eyes locking onto the judge's bench. Whatever Harwood or anyone else thought, he was ready. They'd see soon enough. Jonathan Mitchell stood at the defense table in the Lincoln County Courthouse, Riverside, California, his hands steady despite the pulse hammering in his ears. The weight of the room's stairs pressed against him, but he kept his eyes on Judge William Harwood, whose smirk lingered like a challenge. The judge's glasses glinted under the fluorescent lights as he tilted his head, waiting for the boy in the oversized suit to falter. Jonathan didn't. He took a breath, deep and deliberate, and opened his mouth. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear, cutting through the hum of the courtroom, "I am here representing my brother, Samuel Mitchell." The words landed like a stone in still water. A heavy pause swallowed the room, so thick it seemed even the old clock on the wall hesitated. The bailiff, a burly man with a graying mustache, blinked in surprise, his hand pausing on his belt. Catherine Reynolds, the prosecutor, looked up from her notes, her pen frozen mid-scribble, one eyebrow arching sharply. From the third row, a man in a faded jacket stifled a laugh, but It died quickly under the weight of the silence. Jonathan's heart raced, but he kept his face composed, his dark eyes unwavering. He could feel Samuel watching from the back, his brother's orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the muted tones of the courtroom, his cuffed hands still but his gaze burning with something fierce. Hope, maybe? Or pride? Judge Harwood leaned back, his smirk stretching wider. "Representing?" he said, the word dripping with skepticism. "You mean observing, son." Jonathan didn't hesitate. He reached into his battered briefcase and pulled out a document, its edges crisp and notarized. "No, sir, representing," he held it up, his voice steady. Samuel filed a pro se motion, requesting self-representation. He then designated me, under California's lay representation allowances, to act as his representative. The room shifted, whispers flickering like sparks. A woman in the gallery clutched her purse, her eyes wide, while a young man in a corner seat leaned forward, mouthing, "Is that legal?" Harwood's expression flickered, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. He adjusted his glasses and gestured for the bailiff to take the document. As the paper changed hands, Jonathan's mind flashed back to a memory from years ago, when he was just a skinny kid of 10, sitting on the worn couch in their Riverside apartment. Samuel, then 19, had knelt in front of him, teaching him how to knot a tie for a school event. "You're going to do big things, John," Samuel had said, his grin wide, his hands patient as he looped the fabric. "Bigger than me, just keep your head up." That moment had stayed with Jonathan, a quiet promise that fueled him now. Samuel had always believed in him, even when the world didn't. Now it was his turn to return that faith. The judge scanned the document, his brow furrowing. "You're 18, he said. "Not a question, but a challenge." "Yes, sir," Jonathan replied, his tone even. "No license, no formal legal training." "No, sir." Jonathan glanced briefly at the gallery, catching Samuel's eye, steady, unblinking, full of quiet strength, before turning back to Harwood. "But I've studied the law for 3 years. I've read every page of my brother's case file twice. I know what I'm doing." The courtroom went still, the earlier chuckles replaced by a taut, uncomfortable silence. A woman in a floral dress shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around a tissue. The clerk, who'd been typing, paused, her hands hovering over the keyboard. Harwood exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping the bench. "Well, we'll see how long that confidence lasts," he said, his voice dry. He turned to Catherine Reynolds. "Ms. Reynolds, is the paperwork in order?" She hesitated, flipping through her notes, then nodded reluctantly. "It's unusual, but legal." Harwood shook his head, a faint crease forming between his brows. "This is a preliminary hearing," he said, his eyes locking on to Jonathan. "We're here to decide if there's enough to proceed to trial. If your brother wants you to speak for him, I won't stop you." Jonathan didn't smile, didn't nod. He just said, "Yes, Your Honor," and sat down, his hands folding neatly over his files. From the back, Samuel watched, his lips pressed tight, but his eyes shone with something new. Jonathan could feel it even without looking, a connection forged through years of shared struggles, of late-night talks and unspoken promises. As the clerk called the case, State of California versus Samuel Mitchell, the room seemed to reset, the air charged with anticipation. Jonathan's fingers brushed the edge of his briefcase, the worn leather a reminder of why he was here. He wasn't just a kid in a baggy suit. He was Samuel's voice, his hope, his fight, and he was just getting started. The Lincoln County Courthouse in Riverside, California held its breath as Jonathan Mitchell sat at the defense table, his hands resting lightly on the stack of folders he'd arranged with care. The silence in the room was heavy, charged with the weight of what he'd just declared, that he, an 18-year-old with no formal training, would represent his brother Samuel Mitchell in a felony case. Judge William Harwood leaned forward, his reading glasses slipping low on his nose, his smirk now a thin, sharp line. His eyes bored into Jonathan, searching for a crack, a hint of doubt. "You understand, son," Harwood said, his voice slow and deliberate. "This isn't a school debate. This is a courtroom. A felony case, serious business." Jonathan met the judge's gaze, his heart pounding but his expression steady. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice clear, carrying a quiet strength that seemed to surprise even himself. He could feel the room's attention shift, the earlier whispers fading into a taut stillness. A woman in a floral dress in the gallery clutched her tissue tighter, her eyes wide with curiosity. A man in a worn denim jacket leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, as if trying to catch every word. Jonathan's fingers brushed the edge of his dog-eared California Penal Code. The book's worn spine a reminder of the countless nights he'd spent studying, preparing for this moment. Harwood raised an eyebrow. "You're 18, he said, the words laced with skepticism. "No law degree, no license. You're telling me you're ready for this?" Jonathan nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes, sir. I've studied the law for 3 years. I've read every document in my brother's case twice. Every report, every statement, every ruling." He paused, glancing briefly at the gallery where Samuel sat, his brother's eyes locked on him, steady and proud. "I know what's at stake." The judge's smirk flickered, his fingers tapping the bench slowly, rhythmically, like a metronome counting down to judgment. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with unspoken questions. A young clerk by the wall shifted her weight, her pen hovering over her notepad, her lips parted slightly in disbelief. From the third row, an older woman in a red scarf whispered to her neighbor, "This boy's serious. He's not backing down." Jonathan caught the words faintly, and they steadied him, like a hand on his shoulder. He thought of those late nights in the Riverside Community Library, hunched over a scratched wooden table, his cracked iPhone playing recorded law lectures through cheap earbuds. The library's fluorescent lights had buzzed overhead, and the smell of old books had filled the air as he scribbled notes, driven by a fire he couldn't explain. It wasn't just about Samuel's case. It was about proving something bigger, something no one in this room expected him to understand. Harwood exhaled, long and slow, his gaze never leaving Jonathan. 3 years, you say, he muttered, almost to himself. Well, we'll see how far that gets you. He turned to Catherine Reynolds, the prosecutor, who sat with her arms crossed, her sharp eyes flicking between Jonathan and her notes. "Miss Reynolds, any objection to this arrangement?" Reynolds hesitated, her lips pursing as she flipped through her papers. "The paperwork's in order," she said finally, her tone clipped. "It's unconventional, but it's within California law." Harwood's brow creased, a shadow of doubt crossing his face. He looked back at Jonathan, his voice hardening. "This is your brother's future, son. You sure you're not in over your head?" Jonathan's mind flashed to a moment 3 years ago, when Samuel was first arrested on a minor charge that spiraled into this nightmare. Jonathan had sat in their cramped apartment, watching their mother cry silently at the kitchen table, her hands folded over a stack of unpaid bills. He'd felt helpless then, a skinny 15-year-old with no power to fix anything. But that night, he'd promised himself he'd never feel that way again. He'd started reading, learning, digging into the law with a hunger that surprised even him. Now, standing in this courtroom, he felt that same fire burning, stronger than ever. "I'm sure, Your Honor," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'm here because no one else would fight for him the way I will." The silence that followed was different now, not mocking but heavy with a new kind of tension. A man in the back row adjusted his glasses, his notebook open on his lap, scribbling furiously. The woman in the red scarf nodded slowly, her whisper barely audible. "Lord, that boy's got heart." Harwood leaned back, his smirk gone, replaced by a faint crease between his brows. "Very well," he said, his tone flat but laced with something new. Curiosity, maybe, or grudging respect. "Let's proceed." Jonathan sat down, his hands folding over his files, his heart still racing but his focus razor sharp. He could feel Samuel's eyes on him, a silent anchor in the storm of the courtroom. The fight was just beginning, and Jonathan knew every word, every move had to count. He wasn't just a kid in a borrowed suit anymore. He was Samuel's voice, and he wouldn't let anyone silence it. The Lincoln County Courthouse in Riverside, California, crackled with tension as the preliminary hearing unfolded. Jonathan Mitchell, 18 years old and standing tall in his father's oversized Navy suit, had just declared his intent to represent his brother, Samuel Mitchell. Now, as Catherine Reynolds, the prosecutor, concluded her opening, laying out charges of burglary, resisting arrest, and possession of stolen property, the room turned its eyes to Jonathan. She'd called it a simple case. Samuel caught fleeing a home with electronics in his car, identified on the spot by the arresting officer. She sat down, her expression confident, but Jonathan noticed what she didn't say. No mention of fingerprints, no mention of Samuel's alibi, no mention of the anonymous tip that led to his arrest. Jonathan stood, his heart thudding but his movements calm. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. "May I cross-examine the officer?" Judge William Harwood's eyebrows lifted, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He nodded. "You may?" Officer Daniel Mercer, 46, stepped to the stand, his broad frame filling the space like a linebacker. His radio-ready voice boomed as he swore in, but Jonathan caught the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, the way his eyes darted briefly to Catherine Reynolds. The room leaned in, the air thick with anticipation. A woman in a red scarf in the gallery gripped her tissue, her knuckles white, while a man in a denim jacket scribbled in a notebook, his pen moving furiously. Jonathan flipped open a file, his fingers steady despite the weight of every stare. "State your name for the record," he said, his tone not loud but commanding, like a conductor setting the tempo. Mercer blinked. "You serious?" Jonathan didn't flinch. "Name, please?" A few people in the back tensed, their breaths catching. Mercer cleared his throat. "Daniel Mercer?" Jonathan nodded. "You testified you saw my brother inside the vehicle with the stolen property. A flat-screen TV and 2 laptops, correct?" Mercer's jaw tightened. "Yeah." Pulled him over after a tip. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. "This tip, did you log it?" Mercer hesitated, his fingers twitching at his side. "No." The courtroom stirred, whispers rippling like a breeze. Jonathan's mind flashed to a moment 2 weeks ago, when he'd sat on the floor of his bedroom, surrounded by case files, his cracked iPhone screen glowing with a neighbor's Ring camera footage. He'd watched it over and over, his heart racing as he realized the timestamp didn't match Mercer's report. That discovery had felt like a spark in the dark, a thread of hope he could pull to unravel the case. Now, standing here, he held that thread tightly. "You said he ran," Jonathan continued, his voice even. "You stopped him?" Mercer nodded. "He tried. I stopped him." Jonathan reached into his file and pulled out a photo, holding it up. "Then how do you explain this?" The image showed Samuel face down, handcuffed, kneeling on the pavement, time-stamped 5 minutes before the traffic stop was officially recorded. Gasps punctured the silence. Mercer blinked, his face paling. Harwood leaned forward, his glasses slipping down his nose. "Where did you get that?" the judge asked. Jonathan's voice didn't waver. "A neighbor's Ring camera, Your Honor. The arrest didn't happen during the stop. It happened before." "That's an unlawful seizure." The temperature in the room shifted, the whispers growing louder. A young woman in the second row covered her mouth, her eyes wide. The man in the denim jacket muttered, "This kid's got guts." Samuel, seated in the back, sat taller, his cuffed hands still, but his gaze locked on Jonathan, a faint spark of pride in his eyes. Jonathan's heart pounded, but he kept his focus, his fingers brushing the worn leather of his briefcase. He thought of the nights he'd spent biking to the Riverside Community Library, his backpack heavy with used law books from a second-hand shop in Santa Barbara. Each page he'd turned, each case he'd studied, had led to this moment. Mercer shifted on the stand, his voice lower now. "I must have gotten the time wrong." Jonathan didn't blink. "So your official report is wrong, your body cam was off, and you didn't log the anonymous tip." Harwood interrupted, his tone sharp. "Let's keep this respectful, Mr. Mitchell." Jonathan nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Of course, Your Honor. I'm just trying to get to the truth." The room buzzed, chairs creaking as people shifted, their attention now glued to the teenager in the baggy suit. A woman in a floral dress whispered to her neighbor, "He's not just talking, he's fighting." Jonathan stepped back to the defense table, his eyes flicking to Samuel for a moment. His brother's face was unreadable, but the look in his eyes said enough. Jonathan's resolve hardened. He wasn't done yet. The courtroom might have underestimated him, but he was about to show them just how wrong they were. Every fact, every question, was a step closer to justice. Not just for Samuel, but for every truth buried under assumption. He adjusted his tie, the knot still crooked, and prepared for what came next. The Lincoln County Courthouse in Riverside, California, hummed with a restless energy as Jonathan Mitchell stood at the defense table, his oversized navy suit a stark contrast to the polished wood and stern faces around him. The 18-year-old had just shaken the room by exposing flaws in Officer Daniel Mercer's testimony, and now the air crackled with expectation. Judge William Harwood's earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a furrowed brow as he watched Jonathan, his glasses glinting under the courtroom's harsh lights. Catherine Reynolds, the prosecutor, sat stiffly, her pen tapping her notepad, her confidence fraying at the edges. Jonathan's heart beat fast, but his hands were steady as he reached into his worn briefcase, pulling out a single sheet of paper, a sworn statement that could change everything. "I'd like to submit a sworn statement from Mrs. Clara Thompson," Jonathan said, his voice calm but firm, the homeowner whose house was allegedly burglarized. The room stirred, a low murmur spreading like wildfire. A woman in a red scarf in the gallery leaned forward, her eyes wide, while a man in a denim jacket stopped scribbling in his notebook, his mouth slightly open. Harwood raised an eyebrow, gesturing for the bailiff to take the document. "You had her sign this yourself?" the judge asked, his tone laced with curiosity. Jonathan nodded. "Yes, sir. Yesterday afternoon." Jonathan's mind flashed to that moment, standing on the cracked porch of Mrs. Thompson's small bungalow in a quiet riverside neighborhood. The sun had been low, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. His palms were sweaty as he knocked, his heart heavy with the fear she might turn him away. But Clara, a woman in her late 60s with kind eyes and a voice softened by years, had listened. "You remind me of my grandson," she'd said, her hands folded over a cup of tea as she spoke. He was misunderstood, too. Jonathan had sat across from her, explaining Samuel's case, his words careful but earnest. When she agreed to sign the statement saying nothing was stolen, he'd felt a surge of hope, like a weight lifting from his chest. Back in the courtroom, Harwood scanned the document, his expression unreadable. "And what does she say?" he asked. Jonathan stood taller, his voice clear. "She says nothing was missing. Her TV was right where she left it. The door was closed, no signs of a break-in." Catherine Reynolds shot to her feet, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, this wasn't in discovery." Jonathan didn't miss a beat, his eyes locking onto hers. "She wasn't interviewed by police. I found her on my own." A few people in the gallery gasped and a soft ripple of applause broke out, quickly hushed by the bailiff's glare. Harwood's eyes narrowed, but he didn't interrupt. "How'd you get her to talk to you?" he asked. Jonathan's lips twitched, almost a smile. "I asked. Politely. A couple of chuckles floated from the back, not mocking this time, but warm, almost admiring. A young woman in a floral dress whispered to her neighbor, "This boy's got something special." Samuel, seated in the back, his orange jumpsuit wrinkled, watched Jonathan with eyes that shone with quiet pride, his cuffed hands still, but his shoulders relaxed for the first time that day. Jonathan's thoughts drifted to the nights he'd spent biking through Riverside streets, his backpack stuffed with notes and law books from a second-hand shop in Santa Barbara. He'd knock on doors, ask questions, chase leads the police had ignored. Each step had been exhausting, each rejection a blow, but Clara's kindness had been a turning point. Her words echoed in his mind now, grounding him as he faced the courtroom. "You're fighting for what's right," she'd said as she signed the statement, her hand trembling slightly. "Don't stop." Harwood handed the document back to the bailiff, his voice measured. "She confirms your brother wasn't in her home?" Jonathan nodded. "She says she didn't see him at all that day. She only learned about the arrest from the local paper." The judge's face tightened, his earlier skepticism replaced by something heavier. Thought, maybe, or doubt. The gallery buzzed, chairs creaking as people shifted, their attention glued to Jonathan. A man in glasses in the third row whispered, "He's turning this whole case upside down." Jonathan stepped back to the defense table, his fingers brushing the edge of his briefcase. He glanced at Samuel, catching the faint nod his brother gave, a silent signal of trust. The room might have doubted him, but Jonathan felt the tide shifting. Clara's statement wasn't just a piece of paper. It was proof that the truth could be found if you looked hard enough. He adjusted his crooked tie, his resolve burning brighter. He wasn't done yet, and the courtroom was starting to realize it. The Lincoln County Courthouse in Riverside, California, stood quiet in the early morning light, its stone facade casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalk. Hours before Jonathan Mitchell stepped through its double doors in his father's oversized navy suit, he stood alone by the rusted bike rack, his breath visible in the cool dawn air. His tie, still crooked despite his mother's careful adjustments, fluttered slightly in the breeze. Across the street, cars hummed along Riverside's main drag, their headlights cutting through the haze, but Jonathan's world felt still, heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. His battered briefcase rested at his feet, its frayed leather a testament to the long road that had brought him here. His mind drifted to a conversation from the previous day, just a few feet from this same bike rack. Michael Evans, Samuel's former lawyer, had towered over him, his pinstriped suit crisp, his voice sharp with disbelief. "You can't do this, kid," Evans had said, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Jonathan's slight frame. "Court's not a school project. You're 18, no training, no experience." Jonathan had met his gaze, his voice quiet but firm. "I know. But you don't believe my brother and I do," Evans had scoffed, shaking his head. "Belief doesn't win trials. Evidence does. You're going to get crushed." He had muttered something about kids watching too much TV and walked off, his polished shoes clicking on the pavement. Jonathan's jaw tightened at the memory, his fingers curling around the handle of his briefcase. Evans hadn't seen what Jonathan had seen. The way Samuel's shoulders slumped in the county jail, the way their mother's hands shook as she prayed each night. He thought of the moment Samuel was arrested 3 years ago on a minor charge that snowballed into this felony case. Jonathan had been 15, sitting on the steps of their Riverside apartment, watching police lights flash across the street. The helplessness had burned in his chest, a fire that drove him to the Riverside Community Library, to stacks of used law books bought for $5.00 each at a second-hand shop in Santa Barbara. The smell of old paper, the weight of those books in his backpack. They'd become his armor, his way to fight back. Inside the courthouse now, as Jonathan sat at the defense table, the memory of Evan's doubt fueled him. The room buzzed with a restless energy, the gallery filled with faces, some curious, some skeptical, some simply here for the show. A man in glasses, Mr. Baxter, the town's unofficial court watcher, slipped in late, his notepad already open. He leaned toward a woman in a red scarf, whispering, "What's going on?" she replied, her voice low but clear. "Some kid's defending his brother, he's holding his own." Baxter's eyebrows shot up, and he scribbled furiously, his pen scratching like a heartbeat. Jonathan's eyes flicked to Samuel, seated in the back, his orange jumpsuit stark against the muted courtroom walls. His brother's gaze was steady, a quiet strength that anchored Jonathan. He thought of the late nights he'd spent studying, his cracked iPhone glowing with YouTube videos of old trials, his notebook filled with scribbled notes. Each hour had been a step toward this moment, a promise to Samuel that he wouldn't let him down. The gallery stirred, a few people shifting in their seats, their whispers softer now, tinged with something new. Respect, maybe, or curiosity. A young woman in a floral dress clutched her purse, her eyes locked on Jonathan, as if sensing the fire beneath his calm exterior. Outside, the morning sun had climbed higher, spilling light through the courthouse's tall windows, casting soft patterns on the floor. Jonathan's heart beat steady now, the doubt from Evans fading like a distant echo. He wasn't here to prove himself to the lawyer or the crowd. He was here for Samuel, for the truth. The weight of the law books, the memory of his mother's prayers, the look in his brother's eyes. They carried him forward. As Judge William Harwood called the hearing back to order, Jonathan adjusted his tie, his fingers brushing the worn fabric. Evans might have walked away, but Jonathan was still standing, and he was ready to fight. The Lincoln County Courthouse in Riverside, California, pulsed with a charged silence as Jonathan Mitchell stood at the defense table, his 18-year-old frame steady despite the weight of the moment. His oversized navy suit hung loosely, but his presence filled the room, his dark eyes sharp and unyielding. He'd already shaken the courtroom by dismantling Officer Daniel Mercer's testimony and presenting Clara Thompson's sworn statement. Now, as Judge William Harwood adjusted his glasses, his earlier smirk replaced by a cautious frown, Jonathan felt the tide turning. Catherine Reynolds, the prosecutor, scribbled furiously, her confidence unraveling with each move Jonathan made. The gallery watched, rapt, their earlier skepticism giving way to a tense anticipation. Jonathan flipped open his notebook, its pages dog-eared and scribbled with notes from countless late nights. He turned to Officer Mercer, still on the stand, his broad shoulders slumped slightly, sweat beading on his forehead. "Officer," Jonathan said, his voice calm but piercing, "you testified you found 2 laptops in the vehicle. Do you have the serial numbers of those items?" Mercer's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to Reynolds for a moment. "No," he said, his voice low. "They were logged after the fact." Jonathan's brow lifted slightly. By whom? Mercer hesitated. Property division, Jonathan pressed, his tone measured but relentless. Can you confirm they were reported stolen? Mercer shifted, his fingers twitching. I believe so. That's what I was told. The room buzzed, whispers rippling through the gallery. A woman in a red scarf clutched her tissue, her eyes wide with disbelief, while a man in a denim jacket muttered, "He's cornering him." Jonathan's heart raced, but his face remained composed. He reached into his battered briefcase and pulled out a receipt, holding it up. According to this report from an electronics store 3 blocks from our house, my brother bought those laptops 3 days earlier with his own debit card. The courtroom gasped, the sound sharp and sudden. Mercer stared at the paper, his face paling. Reynolds shot to her feet. Your Honor, I wasn't provided this during discovery. Jonathan met her gaze, unflinching. You didn't ask, Ms. Reynolds, you assumed he was guilty. Judge Harwood raised a hand, his voice firm. Enough. Let me see the document. Jonathan walked it over, his step steady, his crooked tie swaying slightly. Harwood adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable, but a flicker of something. Surprise, perhaps, crossed his eyes. From the 3rd row, a young woman in a floral dress whispered, That boy came with receipts. Jonathan's mind flashed to a moment a week ago, when he'd sat in the dim light of his bedroom, sifting through Samuel's bank statements. His hands had trembled as he found the receipt, a small piece of paper that felt like a lifeline. He'd biked to the store the next day, his backpack heavy with hope, confirming the purchase with the clerk. That discovery had been a spark, a piece of the puzzle falling into place, but Jonathan wasn't finished. He stepped back to the table, his voice steady. I'd like to call my next witness, a man named Marcus Hale. A murmur swept through the room as a man in his mid-30s, with a goatee and faded mechanic's shirt, stood in the back. He raised a hand, his work boots scuffing the floor as he walked to the stand. Harwood's brow furrowed. Was this witness disclosed? Jonathan shook his head. No, sir, but he's relevant. I can explain. Harwood sighed, waving a hand. Make it quick. Jonathan turned to Marcus, who shifted nervously, his eyes avoiding Mercer's. Can you tell the court your relationship to Officer Mercer? Marcus cleared his throat, his voice low. He's my cousin. The gallery gasped, chairs creaking as people leaned forward. Jonathan's pulse quickened, but he kept his tone even. Did he talk to you the night Samuel Mitchell was arrested? Marcus nodded, his hands gripping the stand. Yes. Jonathan stepped closer. What did he say? Reynolds stood, her voice sharp. Objection, hearsay. Jonathan didn't flinch. It goes to motive, Your Honor. Let me finish. Harwood hesitated, then nodded. I'll allow it for now. Marcus swallowed, his eyes darting to Mercer, then back to Jonathan. He said he finally got him, said he was tired of seeing those Mitchell boys walking around like they owned the place. Said Samuel thought he was slick, but he wasn't smart enough to beat a uniform. The courtroom went still, the silence so thick it seemed to hum. Samuel closed his eyes slowly, his face unreadable but his shoulders tense. A woman in the 2nd row covered her mouth, her eyes glistening. Mr. Baxter, the court watcher, scribbled frantically, his pen nearly tearing the paper. Jonathan's mind raced back to the moment he'd found Marcus 2 days ago at a Riverside auto shop. He had waited hours, his bike propped against a wall, until Marcus agreed to talk. I don't want trouble, Marcus had said, wiping grease from his hands. But Jonathan's quiet persistence, his plea for the truth, had won him over. Now, in the courtroom, that persistence was paying off. Jonathan stepped closer to the stand, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. Did he say anything about setting him up? Marcus hesitated, then nodded. He said, 1 anonymous call is all it takes in this town. Were they going to believe, me, or some kid with a smart mouth? The gallery erupted in gasps, sharp and audible. Harwood's expression darkened, his jaw clenching. Reynolds scribbled furiously, her face flushed. Jonathan turned to the judge, his voice steady but heavy with conviction. Your Honor, this demonstrates not just misconduct but a personal bias that tainted the arrest and investigation. Harwood leaned back, his face a mask, but his silence spoke volumes. Jonathan's heart pounded, but he felt a fire burning inside him, fueled by every late night, every door he'd knocked on, every doubt he'd pushed through. He glanced at Samuel, whose eyes met his, a silent nod passing between them. The courtroom might have seen a kid in a baggy suit, but Jonathan was rewriting the story. He wasn't just fighting for his brother. He was exposing a truth that had been buried too long. The gallery buzzed, the air electric with the weight of what had just been revealed. Jonathan adjusted his tie, his resolve unshaken. He was ready for whatever came next. The Lincoln County Courthouse in Riverside, California, seemed to hold its breath as Jonathan Mitchell stood before the defense table, his 18-year-old frame steady in his father's oversized Navy suit. The room was a cauldron of tension after his devastating cross-examination of Officer Daniel Mercer and the bombshell testimony of Marcus Hale, revealing a personal bias behind Samuel Mitchell's arrest. Judge William Harwood sat behind the bench, his earlier smirk long gone, replaced by a deep crease between his brows. Catherine Reynolds, the prosecutor, gripped her pen tightly, her face pale as she scribbled notes, her earlier confidence shattered. The gallery was electric, every eye locked on Jonathan, the teenager who'd turned the hearing upside down. Jonathan took a breath, his hands trembling slightly, but his voice steady as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I have no more witnesses, just a question for the court." Harwood's chin lifted, his glasses glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Go ahead," he said, his tone cautious but curious. Jonathan stepped forward, his crooked tie swaying, his dark eyes burning with a quiet intensity. "What happens when the system makes a mistake and nobody says anything?" The words hung heavy, not loud but piercing, slicing through the silence. The gallery stirred, chairs creaking as people shifted, their breaths catching. A woman in a red scarf clutched her tissue, her eyes glistening, while Mr. Baxter, the court watcher, paused his scribbling, his pen frozen. Jonathan's heart pounded, but he pressed on, his voice growing firmer. "What happens when a person gets arrested not because of what they did, but because of who someone thinks they are?" The room was still, the air thick with the weight of his words. He glanced at Samuel seated in the back, his orange jumpsuit stark, his eyes steady with a pride that fueled Jonathan's resolve. "I've read a lot of case law, Your Honor," Jonathan continued, "more than most people my age. I've read your rulings, too, from 2003 to now. There's one case from 2010, State v. Delgado. Do you remember that one?" Harwood's face twitched, a fleeting shadow crossing his eyes. "Of course," he said, his voice tight. Jonathan nodded, his tone measured but unrelenting. "Then you remember the witness who changed her statement, the missing dashcam footage. You still let it go to trial, and that man was convicted." The gallery gasped softly, a ripple of shock spreading. Jonathan's mind flashed to a night 3 months ago, when he'd sat in the Riverside Community Library, a stack of case files spread across a scratched table. Reading the Delgado case, he'd felt a surge of anger. Anger at a system that could fail so completely, at a man who'd lost 5 years of his life before the conviction was overturned. That anger burned in him now, a fire that steadied his voice. Harwood's jaw clenched, but before he could speak, Reynolds stood, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, is this cross-examination or a lecture?" Jonathan didn't flinch, his eyes still on the judge. "It's not about revenge," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "It's about accountability." He turned to the gallery, his gaze sweeping over the faces, some skeptical, some moved, some simply stunned. "How many people in this room know someone who's been locked up for something they didn't do?" Hands went up one by one, hesitant at first, then bolder. A man in a denim jacket raised his face grim. A young woman in a floral dress lifted hers, tears brimming. The room buzzed, the sound of shifting chairs and muffled whispers filling the space. Jonathan's thoughts drifted to his mother, to the nights she'd sat at their kitchen table, her hands folded over unpaid bills, praying for Samuel's freedom. He'd promised her he'd fight, promised himself he'd never let the system swallow his brother. Now, standing here, he felt the weight of that promise in every word. "You asked me earlier if I knew what I was doing," Jonathan said, turning back to Harwood. "I do. I'm standing up for my brother because no one else would, not even you." The words landed like a thunderclap, not loud but heavy, reverberating through the room. Harwood's face stiffened, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench. A woman in the second row whispered, "Lord, that boy's speaking truth." Mr. Baxter's pen scratched furiously, his eyes wide. Samuel sat taller, his gaze locked on Jonathan, a faint nod passing between them. Harwood adjusted his robe, his voice low but strained. "The court will take a short recess. I'll issue a ruling within the hour." He tapped the gavel and stood, his robe sweeping as he exited through the side door. But not before shooting Jonathan one last look, not a smirk, not sarcasm, but something raw, like a man seeing his own reflection for the first time. Jonathan sat down slowly, his hands folding over his files, his heart still racing. Samuel leaned forward behind him, his voice a whisper. "You all right?" Jonathan didn't look back, his eyes fixed on the judge's empty bench. "I think I finally made him listen." The gallery buzzed, a low hum of awe and disbelief. A man in the back muttered, "I don't know who raised that kid, but they did something right." Jonathan's fingers brushed the worn leather of his briefcase, the memory of his mother's prayers grounding him. He'd spoken for Samuel, for Delgado, for every name the system had overlooked, and he wasn't done yet. The Lincoln County Courthouse in Riverside, California, was cloaked in a strange, heavy quiet as the recess ended. The air felt thin, charged with the weight of what Jonathan Mitchell, an 18-year-old in an oversized Navy suit, had just done, challenging the system, exposing bias, and demanding justice for his brother Samuel Mitchell. Jonathan sat alone at the defense table, his elbows resting on the polished wood, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the door through which Judge William Harwood would return. His heart pounded, but his face was calm, betraying none of the storm inside. Across the aisle, Catherine Reynolds sat stiffly, her notes untouched, her lips pressed into a thin line. The gallery was restless, yet no one left, not the woman in the red scarf clutching her tissue, nor Mr. Baxter, his notepad filled with furious scribbles. Jonathan's mind drifted to his mother's words, spoken just days ago in their cramped Riverside apartment. "You fight for what's right, John," she'd said, her voice trembling as she smoothed his tie, "no matter what they throw at you." He'd nodded, the weight of her trust anchoring him. Now, as he waited, he thought of Samuel, of the visits to the county jail, where his brother's tired eyes had held a flicker of hope. Jonathan had promised to bring him home, and every late night at the Riverside Community Library, every page of law he'd studied had been for this moment. The memory of his mother's calloused hands, her quiet prayers, steadied him now, like a lighthouse in a storm. The door creaked open and Harwood returned, his robe dragging slightly, his face unreadable. He sat, shuffled his papers, and looked up. "This hearing is now back in session," he said, his voice flat. "My ruling will be delivered orally and entered into the record." The room seemed to lean forward, every breath held. A young woman in a floral dress gripped her purse, her knuckles white. Jonathan's fingers brushed the worn leather of his briefcase, his pulse racing but his focus sharp. Harwood cleared his throat. "After reviewing the evidence presented, some of which was, admittedly, unexpected, it is the opinion of this court that the prosecution has not demonstrated sufficient cause to proceed to trial." Gasps erupted, sharp and sudden, followed by a single clap from the back, quickly shushed. Jonathan's heart leapt, but he didn't move, his eyes locked on the judge. Harwood continued, his voice measured. "The charges against Samuel Mitchell are hereby dismissed with prejudice." The room exploded into sound, murmurs rising, shoulders dropping, a soft sob breaking from a woman in the second row. Samuel looked at Jonathan, his mouth opening then closing, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. Jonathan felt a lump in his throat, but he kept his expression steady, his hands folded tightly to hide their trembling. Harwood tapped the gavel once more. "Mr. Mitchell is free to go." The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room. Reynolds didn't stand, her face pale as she bit the inside of her cheek. Officer Daniel Mercer rose abruptly and slipped out the side door, his head down, his steps heavy. Jonathan stood slowly, gathering his notes with deliberate care, as if it were just another day. But inside his heart soared, the weight of 3 years of struggle lifting at last. He glanced at Samuel, whose cuffs had been removed by a bailiff, his brother's face breaking into a rare, unguarded smile. Harwood remained at the bench, his eyes following Jonathan. Then, in a move no one expected, he cleared his throat. "Mr. Mitchell, would you approach the bench?" The courtroom stilled, the air taut with curiosity. Jonathan walked forward, his step steady despite the eyes boring into him. Harwood leaned in, his voice low, meant for only a few to hear. You made me look in a mirror I've been avoiding for a long time, he said, his tone heavy with something like regret. Jonathan didn't smile. It wasn't about triumph. Sir, he said softly, I just wanted my brother back. Harwood nodded, a faint crease in his brow. Well, you got him. And you might have changed more than you know. He paused, then added, Don't stop. Jonathan stepped back, his heart pounding but his face composed. Harwood stood and disappeared through the side door, his robe sweeping behind him. The gallery broke into applause, not loud but deep, the kind that carried weight. A man in a denim jacket shouted, This kid just made history in Riverside! Jonathan walked to Samuel, who was now uncuffed, holding his hoodie and wallet. They stood face to face, no words at first. Samuel shook his head, his eyes glistening. You did the impossible, he said, his voice thick. Jonathan shrugged, fighting a smile. Wasn't impossible, just ignored. The crowd parted as they moved toward the exit, some nodding, others staring in awe. A woman in her 60s, her hair in a tight bun, reached out to touch Jonathan's arm, whispering, God bless you, son. Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. He thought of his mother again, of the way she'd held him after Samuel's arrest 3 years ago, her voice breaking as she said, We'll get through this. That promise had carried him here, to this moment where the truth had finally won. As they reached the courtroom doors, the applause faded, but the weight of what Jonathan had done lingered, a spark that would burn far beyond these walls. The sun hung low over Riverside, California, casting a warm, golden glow across the cracked sidewalks outside the Lincoln County Courthouse. Jonathan Mitchell, 18 years old, walked side by side with his brother Samuel, their steps light despite the weight of the day. Jonathan's oversized navy suit jacket swung open in the breeze, his crooked tie looser now, a quiet symbol of the battle he'd just won. Samuel, free at last, clutched his hoodie and wallet, his face breaking into a grin as he glanced at Jonathan. You really rode your bike to court? He asked, his voice tinged with amusement. Jonathan chuckled, shrugging. Gas money ain't free. Their laughter echoed softly, a sound of relief and reunion as they passed the courthouse steps, where a local reporter fumbled with a microphone, eager to catch the story of the teenager who'd made history. Jonathan's heart felt full, but his thoughts turned to one last place, one person, who'd been part of this journey without ever setting foot in the courtroom. His shoes crunched over gravel as he crossed the back parking lot, Samuel trailing behind, leaning against Jonathan's bike. A small brick building sat on the corner of Broad and Elm, its faded sign reading Riverside Community Library. Jonathan pushed open the door, stepping into the familiar smell of old pages and worn carpet. At the front desk, Ms. Eleanor Parker, 62, looked up from her crossword, her glasses held together with tape, her hair in a slightly lopsided bun. Shouldn't you be in school? She asked, her teasing grin softening her sharp tone. Jonathan smiled, the warmth of her voice wrapping around him like a blanket. I was, kind of. Eleanor squinted, then leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Wait, don't tell me you did it. Jonathan nodded slowly, his throat tight. Her face cracked into a wide grin, her crossword forgotten. I knew it! Been watching you in that corner every day, like the books owed you money. Jonathan laughed, the sound easing the tension he'd carried for months. They kind of did, he said, his voice light. Eleanor stood, rounding the desk with surprising speed, and pulled him into a hug that smelled of cinnamon gum and old bookmarks. I'm proud of you, she whispered, her voice thick. Don't let this town shrink you down, you hear? Jonathan nodded, his eyes stinging as he pulled back. He glanced at the familiar table in the corner, where he'd spent countless evenings, headphones in, notebook open, poring over law books under the library's buzzing fluorescent lights. He walked over, running his hand across the scratched surface, the memories flooding back. 3 years ago, after Samuel's first arrest, Jonathan had come here, a skinny 15-year-old with no plan, only a burning need to help. He'd found a stack of used law books at a shop in Santa Barbara, their pages yellowed but heavy with possibility. Each case he'd read, each note he'd scribbled, had been a step toward today, a promise kept to Samuel, to their mother, to himself. Outside, Samuel waited on the sidewalk, the sun warming his face, his posture relaxed for the first time in years. Jonathan looked out the window, his heart swelling at the sight. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked, her voice pulling him back. Jonathan's gaze lingered on his brother. "I don't know," he said softly. "But I'm not done." Eleanor nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. "You're just getting started, kid." That afternoon, Riverside began to see Jonathan Mitchell differently. Some still whispered, others stared, but more spoke his name with a pause, like it carried weight. 3 weeks later, the local paper ran a headline: "Teen legal prodigy frees brother in courtroom standoff." It wasn't entirely accurate, but the message stuck. Officer Daniel Mercer quietly took early retirement, his name fading from the precinct. Catherine Reynolds was reassigned to a quieter circuit, her sharp confidence dimmed. Judge William Harwood started showing up differently, less smirking, more listening. At the next town meeting, when a teenager proposed a fund for kids who couldn't afford test prep, Harwood stood beside her, no robe, just a man trying to do better. Jonathan didn't become famous overnight. No scholarships rained down, no law school offers arrived. But he kept studying, kept showing up at the library, sometimes with a few younger kids trailing him, flipping through the same books he'd once devoured. He'd won for Samuel, but also for every kid, told, "You're too young," or "This isn't for you." His victory wasn't just a verdict, it was a spark, a reminder that genius isn't about age or title, but about truth and the courage to speak it. Jonathan thought of his mother, of the nights she'd sat up, praying over a candle, her faith unwavering. He thought of Samuel, teaching him to tie a tie years ago, saying, "You're going to do big things." That promise had carried him through every doubt, every door slammed in his face. As he left the library, the sun dipping below the horizon, Jonathan felt a quiet certainty. Riverside might be small, but his fight was bigger, and wherever it took him, he'd carry the truth forward, one step at a time. Jonathan's story teaches us that courage and truth can move mountains, no matter your age or odds. One voice, armed with determination, can challenge injustice and inspire change. Never let doubt silence your fight for what's right. Thank you for joining this journey. Your support means the world. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Comment your thoughts, or tell us how you'll stand up for truth. Let's keep the spark alive and build a world where every voice matters.